The day the divorce was finalized, I was completely distraught. I went to the lawyer's office hoping Paul would be there, but he didn't show up, and I finally realized that it was really over. 16 years of my life were over, and I was sobbing over their loss. After my divorce, I was able to make a life with Carl, but at the cost of the life I had lost with Paul. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get Paul out of my head. When I decided I couldn't let go of Carl again after finding him 18 years later, I knew I would lose Paul. I knew it would cost me the marriage I had loved so much for the past 16 years, the family Paul and I had built, and the life we had shared with the wonderful children he and I had produced. I knew it, but I couldn't stop it from happening. I even came up with the idea that I could live a double life, with Paul and with Carl. I knew this was unhealthy, even when I suggested to Paul that I think about it in my letter to him. He didn't even respond, which I was glad he did. If he had agreed, it would have eventually destroyed his self-respect. I had begun my affair with Carl against my sister Evelyn's advice and against my own remorse. How could I do this to my husband after I had sworn my love to him when we were married? I swore to him, and only to him, and for 16 years I kept that promise. But now I had broken it with Carl, and more than once. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't get Carl out of my mind once I found him again. He had become an obsession I could never conquer, even though he and I had broken up over 20 years ago, and I hadn't heard from him in the same number of years. Even harder than losing Paul was the absence of my 2 children, Jason and Christy. That was the one thing Paul did cruelly. Using my infidelity as a weapon, Paul had forced me to give him full custody of the children, and the courts had agreed to visitation every weekend. I couldn't even allow them to see Carl because the custody terms required my visits to be supervised. Carl was seeing the children, but was not able to spend much time with them. Their loss hurt me deeply, but even that loss couldn't stop my obsession with Carl. Now that the divorce was final, Carl and I were able to spend all of our time together. Before the divorce, my attorney had insisted that I keep my relationship with Carl in the shadows and not publicize it, so that Paul would have no reason to bring it to final judgment. I agreed, and Carl and I continued to meet as clandestine lovers in motels, and occasionally at his house. I rented a small apartment where he would occasionally visit, but because of the problems with cable necks and his work for them combined with my work in human resources, we had to keep our relationship a secret lest I be fired for favoritism and Carl lose the assignment he had started. Eventually, Carl got tired of all the restrictions and asked me to quit my job so we could live together. I agreed because I too was going through the loss of my family, home, and children. I quit my job and moved into Carl's house full-time. I found a job at a small communications company that needed someone with my experience, but with a much lower salary and much less responsibility. Because I had worked so hard to get to the level I was at CableNex, I resented having to give up so much, but my obsession demanded it, so I said yes. At first, my life with Carl was what I had envisioned it to be when I dreamed of him as a young girl. He was the one I loved first and best, and the one that fate had ripped out of my life. He was my high school sweetheart, the one around whom I built my fantasy life. We would have been so happy if fate had allowed us to be who we were meant to be. I vowed that now that Carl was back in my life, I would make that a reality. I would build the wonderful world we were destined to share, with Carl by my side. The sex was wonderful too. While Carl wasn't as attentive and patient a lover as Paul was, he was more arousing. He was very aggressive, and I found myself being carried away on waves of passion and lust that filled my every pore. Of course, compared to those first few months when Carl and I had first found each other, their frequency had decreased, but that was to be expected. Such intense passion had to subside or burn out. Paul and I's love affair developed as we got to know each other and continued right up until our divorce. I expected no less from my Carl, but I lacked the love and depth of feeling for Paul. But that would come with time. Paul and I had 16 years. Carl and I were deprived of that time. We were to grow up together, just as Paul and I had to grow up together. Carl and I were married the requisite 6 months after my divorce. I still saw the children on weekends, and other times as agreed upon between Evelyn and Paul. This was a mixed blessing because every time I saw them, I was reminded again of my life with Paul and deeply affected by the loss. Carl was also bothered by these visits, as he was unable to participate and I was gone overnight every weekend. I kept asking Evelyn to beg Paul to let me take the kids home, but she wouldn't listen. I called Paul's home several times, but he didn't answer any of the calls. I left messages begging him to change his mind, but he wouldn't even respond. To make matters worse, I told Carl that I wanted to reopen the custody case and see if I could get the judge to change the order allowing me unsupervised visitation and see if I could regain full custody of the children. Now that we were married and I had quit my job at CableNex, all of Paul's initial threats to expose me were no longer valid. But when Carl found out, he got angry and declared that he didn't want Paul's kids in the house. I begged him, but he absolutely refused. I was heartbroken, but he wouldn't even talk about it. They were Paul's children and he wanted nothing to do with them. I couldn't communicate with Paul directly as he wouldn't allow it, so I had to negotiate everything through Evelyn, and even that was becoming very difficult. Since I had ruined my marriage to Paul with my infidelity, Todd had a hard time forgiving me. Evelyn was my sister, and she accepted me anyway, but not Todd. He blamed me for ruining his friendship with Paul, as Paul no longer spent time with them, afraid to see me. Paul had distanced himself from them, seeing them only to drive and pick up Justin and Christy after my visits. Todd adamantly refused to have anything to do with Carl, and they never became anything other than familiar nods. Todd and I finally got to talking when I told him about his relationship with Carl. The words Todd used to describe me, my betrayal of Paul, and the debauchery I asked Paul to think about became too much. I eventually left in tears, and he and I haven't spoken again since. When I visited the kids, Todd would find reasons to be absent. Evelyn began to resent my presence, but I didn't give up on my children. Even though my life was not the idol I had hoped for, I continued to work and try to build the life of my dreams. I began to rebuild the trust and affection I had lost for a while with Christy after the first breakup and during the divorce. But Justin was more of a problem. He understood that I had betrayed his father, but wasn't entirely sure why. He accepted my relationship with Carl, but not as a father, only as a new husband, and that was still reserved. It was interesting that Christy and Jason had such different attitudes about the whole thing. Justin was a man, and Christy was a woman. Perhaps that was the difference. Over time, I learned that Paul never once told Justin about me cheating on him during our marriage, or that I was the one who had caused our marriage to die. He said that his father only told him that we were estranged from each other. It was just like Paul. Even after what I did to him, he didn't lash out at me or try to hurt me. He was fair and tried to make the best of things. He didn't realize that by divorcing me, he had hurt me much more than I had hurt him. He didn't believe me when I told him that I loved him even more than the day I married him, but I couldn't give up on Carl. He didn't realize that even though I chose Carl over him, losing him had cost me a part of my soul. Even Carl didn't realize it, but I knew and lived with that loss every day of my new life. I expected it to become bearable and finally retreat to the place I had driven Carl to for so many years. But it didn't happen. Just 16 months after my divorce, I gave birth to a son. We named him Carl after his father, but I gave him the middle name Warren, not knowing it was Paul's middle name. Of course, they started calling him Junior, and Christy just adored him. He was her new baby brother, and she asked me what Daddy thought of him. I quickly told her that Daddy didn't know about him, but she could tell him. She was thrilled, but later I noticed that Jason was talking to her, and they seemed to be fighting. I later found out that Jason told Christy that Paul wouldn't like it if she talked about Junior. I understood, but Carl didn't when I mentioned it. He resented Jason's attitude and blamed Paul. Carl and I had been married a little over 2 years when the problem started. He ended up working with CableNex, but didn't meet the schedule they had agreed to. It cost him a bonus, and he was counting on it to make a profit for the year. He was bitter and yelled at me because I had been involved in the original negotiations with CableNex. It was my responsibility to recommend subcontractors and help with incentives and deadlines. He accused me of setting conditions that no one could fulfill, only to have the company walk away from payment. I let him yell as I knew he was worried about money and having to lay off 2 of his employees. Eventually, he got a new contract and things went back to normal. Money was still an issue, but we were getting by. As Jason got older, he visited me less and less often. He never accepted Carl, and we never discussed him together. We were still close, but he had his own friends, and they were important to him. When he was with me, he was out of it, as he put it, and he was uncomfortable with his friends driving to Evelyn's to pick him up and drop him off. So he started staying at his house or Evelyn's, and Christy kept coming over. I missed him, but I understood. When Jason didn't come, I noticed the vacuum, and it made the pain that wouldn't leave me a little stronger. Each year it became more noticeable. I expected it to lessen, but the opposite was happening. When Carl Jr. started growing and demanding more and more of my time, Carl started complaining that I was ignoring his needs. I went back to work as we needed the money, and it was draining me physically. Carl worked late into the evenings and hardly ever helped around the house. He always said it was women's work. I tried to be more attentive, but I was so tired after working all day at my job, picking up my youngest after work and taking care of everyone else when I got home, that I couldn't be what Carl expected me to be. When I told him how I felt, he got angry and ran out of the house. He came home later, but it was happening more and more often, but I couldn't do anything about it. I tried to make it up to him on the weekends, but he started going out more and coming home later. Our intimate life was reduced to Carl only occasionally taking me and then drifting off to sleep. Mostly I was frustrated and depressed, but I put it down to fatigue and money worries. My fantasy was becoming more and more worn out, but I fought to keep it alive. After all I had given, I couldn't let it die. Late one night, when I had finally put my youngest to bed and had some quiet time, Carl came home. He was drunk and acting loud and rude. I asked him to be quieter since the youngest was finally asleep after a tiring day, but he continued to be loud and rude. I finally yelled at him and told him to either shut up or get out. He stopped and looked at me in disgust. "You're just like her. All you want is a baby, and that's all you want. You live only for that brat of yours, and then the 3 of you get together and act like a bunch of kids. And that brat of yours thinks he's too good for me. His own wife ain't got time for him. A man has to go out to get laid. You're all the same." With those words, Carl left, and I didn't see him again for 2 days. I knew that Carl was married to a woman he had met in Germany. They had been married just under 5 years and had 2 boys. I didn't know the terms of their divorce, but she had full custody of the boys, and Carl never saw them after they separated. When I asked him about them, he just shrugged and said they were probably better off without him. When I asked what that meant, he got angry and said that they were the only reason she married him. Just to have children, that's what he said. Carl came home 2 days later looking like he'd been run over by a truck. He was unshaven, dirty, and smelled of alcohol. I was so discouraged when I saw him that I didn't say anything to him for a few days. By the end of that week, he was almost normal and finally apologized. He wouldn't tell me where he had been, but said he had just hooked up with a friend. I left it at that, as I didn't want to make him angry again. It went on like that for 2 weeks. Early Monday evening, I was home. My youngest was in bed and Carl hadn't come home yet. The phone rang and a woman asked to get Carl. I told her he wasn't home. "Well, tell that son of a bitch to call me when he gets home. I'm running late and he better get ready." "Excuse me? Why late? What does he have to do with this?" "Listen, bitch, he knows exactly what I mean, so just tell him that when he drags his lazy ass back to wherever you are." With those words, she hung up the phone with a clatter. I sat there for ages, mulling over what I had just heard. Carl was cheating on me, and the woman he was cheating with was pregnant. She knew about me, but apparently she didn't care. How could he do this to me? I was here at home taking care of his child, cooking him dinner, and working my ass off to help with expenses, and he was having fun with another woman. How dare he? I was furious and was going to give him a real beating when he got home. This could not be tolerated. As I sat there seething with anger, there was a thin voice in the back of my mind that laughed at me. It was coming from the place where I'd held Paul and, more recently, Jason. It was that small, empty place that seemed big enough to swallow up all my fears, all my lost dreams and the parts of my teenage fantasy life that didn't match my reality. A place where I kept all those pieces of my life that didn't fit the reality I was living with. I thought it was Paul laughing, looking at the fantasies I had realized when I left him for Carl. He could see the broken pieces that kept falling as I watched dream after dream crumble into dust. The irony was too much. I had started my life with Carl by cheating and betraying my husband. Now Carl was doing the same to me. It was fate's will for me to return the hurt and pain I had caused others. The same weapon I used to destroy Paul's life was now destroying mine. I finally realized what I had lost. What I had given up for a crazy teenage dream that had remained unrealized for so long that it had become an obsession. It was never true, never real, and never possible. Her time had passed 20 years ago, but I just didn't realize it. I had a new, much better dream that I lived for 16 years, but I never realized it when I had to make a choice. A choice between a solid reality with a wonderful husband who loved me, 2 children we adored, and a life of nothing or a childish fantasy. It was a dream that most women search their whole lives for but never find. I had one, but I threw it away for a dream that turned into a sick obsession. I chose fantasy over reality. When Carl finally came back, he looked like hell, he smelled like a brewery, and he went straight to bed and slept for another day. I let him sleep while I decided what I was going to do. I could fight to save this farcical marriage to a man I didn't even know, or I could just end it now and try to move on with my life as best I could. I didn't have much of a choice, but I finally realized that my fantasy was dead. Carl and I tried to stay together for another 2 months, but it was getting worse. We fought over money, plans, bills, and other unimportant things. Finally, one night when he came home after hours of drinking with friends, I told him it was over. Now, I think there was a look of relief on his face then, though he didn't say anything. He just nodded and went to bed. The next morning, we discussed the matter and decided to end it without further ado. When we both looked at our lives in the cold light of day, we discovered that there had been no love, only pretense. Shortly thereafter, I filed for divorce, and it went smoothly and without argument. I kept Carl Jr. and Carl agreed to pay a small amount of child support. I didn't really need anything from him, but I had to do something to help my meager paycheck. I never had the opportunity for advancement because of the need to take care of the house and the baby. Funny, but with Paul, that was never a problem. It had been almost 4 years since Paul kicked me out of our home and my divorce was final. It's funny that I found Carl again after 20 years of unfulfilled fantasies, but the happiest time for me in those 20 years was in the marriage I left. I had spent the last 4 years with Carl, my fantasy lover, and honestly, I couldn't recall a time when I was truly happy. Looking back, I remembered with joy the birth of Carl Jr., but otherwise only regret and sadness. Part of it was the loss of my children, but even when they were with me, it wasn't the same. They belonged to a different world and were happier away from me. I moved in with Evelyn and Todd for a while until I found my own place. I talked to Todd, apologized for what I had done to him, and he finally accepted me back. He understood that I now realized all my mistakes and the disaster I had made of my life. He agreed to help me move, and in general, he adored Carl Jr. By this time, his 3 children were all grown up, and he missed the innocence they had when they were younger. I was finally able to get a job at CableNex again, and with my experience, I started making a good salary and was able to afford a small place for Carl Jr. and me to live. He was already 2.5 years old and was bright and energetic. As soon as I was divorced, Evelyn contacted Paul, and he agreed to let me visit Christy unsupervised. She was able to stay with me on weekends, and the 3 of us had a wonderful time. Christy was almost 15 years old now, and she was becoming a beautiful young woman. I was so proud of her and realized that Paul had done a wonderful job raising her and Jason. Jason was 17 years old and enrolled at a prominent university in the fall. He had a full scholarship and wanted to become an engineer like his father. He sent me an invitation to his high school graduation and wanted me to attend. I, of course, accepted. I was secretly wondering if Paul would be there. The graduation fell on a Friday night, and Christy was with me that weekend. She and I drove to the auditorium together and found 2 good seats near the entrance. I looked around, but the auditorium was very crowded and Paul was nowhere to be seen. I decided to forget about him for the evening and focus on my son. I wanted to look my best for Jason, so I spent half the day looking for the right dress. It was very expensive and custom-made to fit me perfectly. My shoulders were covered, but my arms were bare and the cleavage was almost invisible. I knew it could be called prim, but I didn't want to question the image I wanted to show off to his friends. I knew he was concerned about my presence, but refused to consider not inviting me. It made me sad to realize that I had caused him this problem. One day, Todd told me that Jason finally got his dad to show him the letter I had written to him. Jason read it and had a hard time accepting my infidelity. Todd said he was furious for days before he finally came to terms with it. He was the only one of everyone but me and Paul who knew what I had done, but he felt like everyone would know if they saw me there. But bless his heart, he invited me anyway. Graduation went just as I expected, and I was so proud watching my son cross the stage to receive his diploma. He turned and waved, and I saw his gaze stop at someone else and then shift to me. His face lit up and he waved before stepping aside. It was a magical moment for me. I cried with pride and shamelessness. When prom was over, I waited outside for Jason. Christy had gone to her friends and we agreed to meet at the car in half an hour. I had my camera and I needed pictures. As many pictures as it would let me take. My son, a senior. I was so proud. I watched the students and families that crowded around. So many smiling faces. So much love. They are all so full of life and zest for life. I hope all their dreams come true. My heart sank for a second when I heard a voice behind me. I immediately knew who it was, and I had no doubts. I had been hearing that voice in my head for the past 20 years. Yes, 20 years. Turning around, I saw Paul standing there in a dark blue suit and a beautiful burgundy tie. He looked older. There was more gray in his hair and his eyes were deeper and somehow darker. He had lost weight, but it suited him well. He was still a very handsome man, and my heart jumped at the sight of him. I thought carefully about what I should say. Since I hadn't spoken to Paul in over 4 years, my first words had to be the right ones. Maybe they should be careful with their dreams. Reality is much more solid and reliable. Dreams can become obsessions and cause a lot of pain. I paused briefly before continuing. I think dreams rarely bring true happiness. That's true, but I believe that dreams should be followed, if only to teach us what's important in our lives. Have you found your dream, Kathy? Were you happy? This question was much easier to answer. It didn't require me to do any thinking. Yes, Paul, I was happy. I was happy for 16 wonderful years. I had everything a woman could wish for, and I had cast it aside for a dream built on a fairy tale romance with a fairy tale prince. The light from that dream was so bright that it blinded me, and I missed everything that was real. In the end, the prince turned out to be just a man and the romance was just a wish. The dream died, and only reality remained. Paul watched me speak my words to him. I just wanted to let him know that I was truly happy with him and our family. I wanted him to realize that I was wrong, and that I had set this whole thing up for nothing. Not to show him that he was right and I was wrong, but to let him know that he mattered to me in the end. He was all that had ever mattered to me. He started to say something, but then Jason called out to us and came running in with his friends. He hugged me, shook his dad's hand, and introduced us as his family. We laughed and talked for a few minutes, congratulating each other, and then he left. I insisted on a picture, and Paul took a few shots of me and my son. He kept a good-natured demeanor, but I could see he was anxious to be with his friends. Finally, I relented and let him go. Paul and I stood and watched our son walk off into his future. He was going to do well. He was strong, bright, and confident. He was our future. I turned to Paul to say goodbye, but before I could say anything, he reached out and took my hand in his. My heart stopped and time stood still. I didn't dare look at his face, afraid of what I might see. I just waited, looking at my hand in his. Would you like to have a cup of coffee with me? We could just talk and get reacquainted. Our son just graduated high school, and we need to talk about his future and what he wants to do. I finally looked up and saw him smiling. It was just a small smile, but it was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. My heart started beating again, but in just a second it went from dead center to 60 miles per hour. I was sure Paul could hear it pounding from where he was standing, but I had to answer him. He was waiting. I'll have to wait for Christy, but I'd really like that. We have a lot to talk about, and I'd like to hear about your plans for our son. Where would you like to go? He just smiled and said, home.